Welcome to another episode of the Futurebuild podcast, where we dive into the inspiring journeys of leaders in the built environment. We discuss the latest innovations and explore how sustainability is shaping the future of construction. Today, we are honoured to have Simon Sturgis, a pioneer in sustainable architecture and carbon accounting. With a career spanning over 3 decades, Simon has been at the forefront driving change towards a more sustainable building practice. In this episode, we will discuss his career journey, his views on sustainability, and the innovations that excite him. We'll also touch on some of the hot topics, including the recent government announcement of building 1.5 million homes, the retrofit challenges and opportunities, Part Z, and what net zero means for architects. So let's dive in. Simon, welcome to the Futurebuild podcast. It's an absolute privilege to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
I wanted to start off by asking you a little bit about your career, really, and what got you into architecture, and in particular, what took you down that path of sustainability and into your work now, really, around embodied carbon.
Gosh, well, there's quite a lot there. I'll try and keep it short, I got involved in. I was trained as an architect, and I started my own practice. I worked for Terry Farrell, actually, and then I started my own practice in some years ago now, and that then led to a lot of work on existing buildings, which was not that cool or fashionable at the time. And I did work for on offices refurbishment and also on private houses, like the Lloyd Webbers and things like that. So kind of interesting times. But then we had the recession of 2007, 8, 9, thereabouts. And about that time, we started to look at the whole issue of disposal of material on actually perfectly good buildings. So we were, as I say, doing refurbishment work. And that quite often involved, taking whole facades off buildings and getting rid of them. And we appreciated that there was no financial value in second-hand facades. But given they weren't in such a bad condition, we thought, well, this is very wasteful. And we came to the conclusion that there was a kind of, a kind of carbon value to the material that we were stripping off and proposing to throw away, and also obviously a lot of waste. So it really kind of came from there. And we then published a book, a thing called Redefining Zero, which the RICS published in 2009-10. And that really kind of was trying to make the point that it's not just about energy, carbon emissions, it's also about materials and emissions associated with materials. And I then sort of, if you like, gradually packed up the architectural business or consultancy and moved whole stop. We moved completely into what consultancy called Sturgis Carbon Profiling, where we did what it says on the tin. And that then, we did work for Google and various others, but that then led to writing a document which was funded by Innovate UK, which became ultimately the RICS professional standard, the first version, which came out in 2017. And we talked to lots of people in the industry and we've put this thing out. And that's kind of what started it for me, if you like, because from that led various different things, including the latest version of the RICS professional standard, which came out at the end of 2023 last year.
So it's really interesting you talk about that sort of role of, going from architect to, consultancy. Do you feel that's really where the profession's evolving?
Well, I think for me, it became something that I became very interested in. I think the profession is evolving in that direction. And I think, in fact, when you start to look at the whole sort of carbon story, if you like, and how that's evolving quite rapidly, and also the trajectory to net zero that the government's requiring by 2050, that what all that means when you add it all together is a fundamental change in architecture. So it's not just better BREEAM rating or anything like that. It is actually, we've got to rethink how we do architecture, if you like. And I think it's that fundamental. And so I think we'll find that, I've written a few articles recently on this exact topic for RIBAJ and Architects Journal and so on. And because I do think that we are at a point in time which is not dissimilar to the beginning of the modern movement. And at the beginning of the modern movement, which occurred obviously at another existential crisis, which was the First World War and then the Second World War, where for various reasons, obviously a lot of destruction primarily, we need to produce a lot of buildings very quickly. And the modern movement produced the sort of intellectual capital which enabled those buildings to happen. And I think with the climate crisis, we're in a sort of similar, if you like, existential crisis, although people have, because it's so slow moving, it's not like bombs falling, it is slow moving, but it is definitely there. We've had for the last 12 months, we've had, the highest temperatures on record. So, this is not some sort of pretend or accidental or temporary thing. And I think architecture has to respond, because I think either the buildings we build are going to contribute to the problem, or they're going to help solve the problem. And we've got to figure out how to do that.
Do you find it frustrating, the sort of the pace of change? You mentioned, reusing facades and the sort of, circular thinking in that respect, or reuse, where really it's only now that we're seeing that on some real exemplar projects.
I suppose on one hand you could say it'd be nice if things moved quicker, obviously. But on the other hand, I think they're going quite a good pace. I mean, if you think about operational energy, that first became an issue that was legislated for and so on in the 1970s with the oil crisis. And we're now, 50 odd years after, and we're still, only recently we moved away from things like Part L to neighbours and TM54 and things that actually measure what is actually happening. So it's taken 50 years for the operational energy, if you like, sector to, I mean that in terms of consultancy, to figure out a better way of doing things. And I think hopefully we can, with the kind of whole life carbon and embodied carbon, we can do that a lot quicker. It was 2011 that the European standard EN 15978 came up, which set the framework for whole life carbon reporting. So, that's only 13, 14 years ago. So, I think things are moving relatively quickly, but yes, of course they should move quickly.
Yeah. You obviously, for your consultancy business, spend a lot of time working with local governance and government at a high level as well. Is there a real challenge around carbon literacy and sort of understanding?
Yes, I think there is. I think it's getting better. I mean, up until last year, I was a special advisor to the Environmental Audit Select Committee and chaired by Philip Dunn. And they had an inquiry they were doing, which was costing carbon in construction and what that all led to. And they were coming at that point from a fairly low base, I think, in fairness. But credit to them, because they wanted to find out much more. And my job was to help select witnesses and also to help choose the questions. I wasn't allowed to choose the answers, but I could choose some of the questions. I think what was interesting was that we had a really good selection of witnesses, but also what was revealing was that a couple of them then ministers came in, and their sort of attitude was kind of slightly what am I doing here? But also they really didn't know what they were talking about on this subject. Now, I think as a consequence of that report and other, I'm not saying that report's primarily responsible, but I'm just saying that together with other initiatives across the built environment industry connected to Parliament, if you like, including Part Z, has raised awareness amongst the relevant ministries. And consequently, I think, now a lot of civil servants have much better understanding. So what was DLUC and is now MHCLG are now much more conversant and much better understanding of what the carbon issues are around construction, the importance of things like retrofit and so on. And I think the Department for Net Zero is, principally focusing on things like low or zero carbon energy so wind turbines and all that. And also the other priority is, of course, insulating existing buildings. But I think there's a lot of wins that the built environment industry can deliver to achieve net zero, which the government is not tackling. I mean, I think embodied carbon emissions, for example, are reckoned to be about 10% of UK emissions, which is more than aviation and shipping combined. Yet there's no legislation for that. Now, Part Z would do that. Part Z would provide some legislation. So I think there's things that the government could get their hands on and make happen, and that would contribute, and it's there for the taking. So,
let's just touch on Part Z actually, because for those that don't know, it'd be great to explain what that is. But also, I personally think it's just an amazing example of industry collaboration as well, and bringing together some prominent organisations behind that as well.
Yes, so Part Z is led by Will Arnold of iStructE, and it's got Yannick Giesekam, Julie Godefroy, Tim Den Decker, myself. I'm going to leave somebody out, which is going to be embarrassing.
We'll put a link to it.
I think a link would be helpful. Thank you. Yeah. And the idea is, so Part L, which people are familiar with, is obviously to do with U values and so on. But Part Z is to actually ensure that people understand the carbon cost of the materials that go into building the facades and structure and so on. So it is, and Will Arnold says actually led it fantastically. And we had a launch at the House of Lords, and we've had questions in both House of Commons and House of Lords on the subject. We've now got over 200 organisations supporting it. Now that 200 are right across the board. So we've got house builders, we've got financial investor institutions, investment institutions, we've got engineering companies, architectural, so, and it's all well known, when I say all, but I mean most of them are well known companies that anybody would most people would probably know or heard of. So it's quite a weighty collection of support, and I think the interesting one, of course, is the house builders, because particularly with the government's intention to build 1.5 million homes, which great. But my view is that those 1.5 million homes could be built, as I mentioned, I think a bit earlier, either well or badly. And if they're built well, with a low carbon sort of direction, fantastic. And that's there for the taking, as I mentioned a bit earlier. These things can be done, and it shouldn't be seen as a problem or an obstacle. I think that, as I said earlier, to do it well is not similar to doing it badly. You just have to make different choices.
And it's interesting that the house builders, are back on board on that, which is fantastic news. But I suppose it is a shift there, the economics, that actually, because there's always been this age-old debate around, well, we could build more sustainably or better quality, it's going to cost a lot more. But that's not really the case anymore.
I think what people are realising is that, firstly, that the supply chains are starting to catch up and provide materials and products that are lower carbon. I think that many house builders are also aware that this sort of legislation is coming down the road one way or another. And in a way, they'd rather get on with it, I think, because once they know the direction, many of these house builders will place orders for materials years ahead. So they want to know that what they're buying today is going to be still good in 5-10 years' time. If something that looks like it's going to happen doesn't happen for another 5 years, it's just going to be annoying. So in a way, they don't really mind. I dare say you'll find a house builder that does mind, but I think in principle, they just want clarity. And I think that that can come because I think, as I say, many suppliers are gearing up, and I think some things about cost. I think many suppliers, as a matter of course, allocate a budget to R&D annually. And I think what's happening now is a lot of that R&D money is going to, if you like, low carbon things rather than bright colours or whatever it might have been in the past. So yes, there is money that has to be spent to improve the supply chain, but I don't think it sort of necessarily could be described as extra money. I think it's sort of existing money that's or allocated money that's sort of being redirected to a degree.
There seems to be a big debate at the moment around this. Well, there always has been around the fabric first approach versus obviously decarbonising, heating and cooling side effects. And I read a recent report saying that fabric first shouldn't be the approach now. Where do you sort of stand on that?
Well, my view is that the thing about fabric first, and this is I think where Part Z will help, is that yes, we've got to do things to the fabric, but I think we need to know what the carbon cost of what we're doing to the fabric is against the carbon benefit of what we do actually achieve. So, for example, something like insulation, there's good insulation and less good insulation, if you like. Between the two, you can get a factor of 10 between high carbon and low carbon insulation. So that's quite a big variation. And also the thickness. Now, if when you're designing a building, you're choosing, shall we say, thinner insulation, but is low carbon, ideally, then what you're doing is enabling your lettable space to be slightly bigger because you're using thinner insulation. But you're also having a reduction in operational carbon costs because you're using, say, less heating or less cooling or whatever it is. So I think these things are interlinked. So I think, to answer your question, I think they are interlinked, and I think we do need to understand all these bits and pieces. I think it's
not a simplistic answer.
No, and I think one of the things I've discovered over the last few years on this is that, yes, everybody wants the quick, easy answer, but it's not that simple. I mean, for example, people tend to think, and I get into trouble every time I say this, but that timber is a solution to everything. But you've got to examine first of all, the carbon cost of timber, obviously, and then you get the sequestration, of course, which is good. Of course, it's renewable, good. But there's a relatively small percentage of timber used at the moment across Europe in construction. It's about, I think it's between 2 and 5% or something like that. If it went up to 20% or 25%, the question you have to ask is, what does that mean for forestry? Given that we need the forestry to suck in the carbon dioxide, if we're going to be slicing them all down to build on the grounds that it's a good thing to do, I think we may create problems for ourselves. And I think we just need to understand that. And if the government takes a grip on all this, they can strategically plan, ensure that the forestry is growing at a rate that is replaceable to deal with an increased demand. And we also need to understand what happens to timber at the end of its life. Is there a problem or not a problem? How does that all work?
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think material specification is a fascinating area at the moment. There's obviously a big drive on biomaterials, and we'd love to see more advancement on things like hemp insulation and hempcrete, and that side of things. But at the same time, the concrete industry are decarbonising and producing lower carbon solutions.
I think that's very interesting. And I think what I find particularly interesting is that people like the concrete industry are aware of their image when it comes to net zero and are working hard to try and deal with that. So I think, and coming back to a point, I think the sort of view I would take is that for every kind of design problem, whether it's structural or facade or whatever, there is an ideal carbon answer, if you like, or a combination of materials to produce an ideal carbon answer. And it's not always the same thing. It might be that actually to use concrete in certain circumstances, or steel and timber, or concrete and timber, or whatever it is, combination, can be the best option. And it may be more to do with, say, things like column spacing than changing material. So it's a question of understanding all these things in the round. And
it's that whole life approach as well for buildings as material banks. And if you can, create more easily dismantlable for a precast, or you said there, for steel, and that aids that as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting about, I don't want to go back to Part Z because, as an industry, sometimes we need less red tape, we need less, regulation and that side. But at the same time, we saw the impact that things like the zero carbon homes standard had and the acceleration towards that before that was cut. Am I right in thinking that across Europe already they're adopting some of the principles of Part Z? And I suppose what's holding it back in the UK?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think the certain aspects are being picked up across Europe, and I think whereas maybe a few years ago, the UK claimed to be leading this in some respects. I think we're probably doing well from a private sector point of view, but I think from a governmental point of view, we're definitely drifting behind. And as I said a bit earlier, there are things that are there for the taking in terms of reducing the carbon impact of construction of all sorts. I mean, the RICS professional standard now covers all building types and infrastructure. So, there's the methodologies there. There's increasing availability of data in terms of EPDs and that kind of thing, or alternative ways of getting that sort of information. And there's more experience about, there are more people who know how to do it, do assessments. So I think, and there's also better understanding of what good looks like. And I think, from my perspective, I think the ideal is to get to a point where the building designers have a sort of, if you like, a carbon intuition where they know the right decisions to make before they do all the calculations. I mean, yes, you've got to do the calculations to prove what you've done, but a bit like engineering, a good engineer will say, well, look, I know we can do this, and then he's got to go back and do the sums. But I think that it would be good if architects and engineers and indeed contractors could sort of zero in on those good choices. As a matter of course. I mean, structurally, for example, most architects could probably draw a beam that's a reasonably sensible thickness for the span, you know what I mean? Because they don't have to calculate, but they just know it's going to be about the right thing. And we need that kind of level of understanding. And for it to embed, the whole carbon thing, to embed itself in design as a regular routine thing. And that, as you mentioned a bit earlier, that requires more information, more understanding, it's education.
I know we touched on it at the start around the sort of the changing role of the architect. Do you think that's then going to change the shape of an architectural practice?
Well, that is an interesting question. I mean, I think, if you go from where Christopher Wren was when he was doing everything, project management, quantity surveying, structural design, everything, architectural design and so on, to what many architects are doing now, which is kind of a planning application and no more. But we still kind of can claim to be lead designer on certain things. Yeah. And I think the whole carbon assessment thing is something that architects could take possession of. And I know that various architectural practices are already doing this. I mean, Field and Clegg Bradley Studios have got their FCBS carbon. Hawkins Brown have got VERT, which is a great new tool that's just about to come out, and is aligned with the RICS professional standards. So there's a lot of understanding, and I think with that kind of thing, then architects can start to take more possession of what materials do and mean. Obviously, quantity surveyors, because RICS was the publisher of the standard, they obviously correctly, not surprisingly, assume that quantity surveyors will take possession of this. SIBSE, on behalf of the, if you like, the MEP or Services Engineering Fraternity, also see themselves as doing it because they see going from energy assessment to carbon assessment as being logical. But I think you need to be, the people who do undertake carbon assessments in an ideal world, I think need to have a really good understanding of materials. So it's not just an assessment, but you can also provide, the team with options for reduction. So you've got a kind of broad knowledge of these things.
I think that material innovation is really hard to keep on top of as well.
Yeah.
I suppose, what are some of the innovations, you talked about there are the solutions still there, and there's some simple solutions to reducing embodied carbon on buildings. What's some of the innovations that are exciting you at the moment?
Well, I think some of it is sort of procurement oriented. So, for example, I know a lot of main contractors have their favourite subcontractors, and that's you're never going to get past that. But on several schemes, I'm aware that when the main contractor's been shown a local subcontractor, which is not on their list, but who is making perfectly good things like windows or whatever it is. So, that cuts down things like transport costs and so on.
Yeah.
And I think those sort of things are good. I think one of the things I came across, I've always assumed that when you make concrete, all the cement's used up, but apparently it isn't. And there's a firm in the Netherlands, and I can't remember their name, unfortunately, but they found a way of excavate or getting unused cement out of concrete. Right? Oh, wow. Apparently they can do this economically. Well, so it's those kind of innovations. Maybe it goes somewhere, maybe it doesn't. Who knows? But I think it's those kinds of. It's the fact that opening up a low carbon perspective on the supply chain, I think definitely has the power to produce innovation and new materials. I think circularity and reuse of things is going to become much more prevalent, and understanding of how best to do that. So I think that for example, I came across some, I can't remember, it's called vacuum glass or something, but it's basically 2-3 millimeter sheets of glass with a 1 millimeter gap. And I don't know how good it is or what its life expectancy really is, but it's quite a new product, and it has little tiny dots of glass that separate the two sheets. Now that very thin material is reckoned to be equivalent to triple glazing, which obviously is about 20 millimeters thick. So you've got things like that, which is 7 millimeters thick versus 20 or whatever millimeters thick. And it's obviously new and it's expensive and all the rest of it. And provided you don't mind little dots, you're all right. But that kind of thing is a direct consequence of material efficiency, reducing the amount of material used to make something, and the demand for low carbon things. And the other thing is that what the manufacturers claim is, I think, something like a 60-year life expectancy for this product. Well, compare that to double glazed units, which last for 25, 30, 35 years, something like that. That's a big plus, because one of the problems with double or indeed triple glazing is when the seals fail, you have to replace it. But that typically goes hand in glove with replacing the framing. So, you get a whole world of carbon cost coming in. And if you can extend the life of a glazed unit, fantastic. Game changer.
100% agree. And it feels like we're at this tipping point where the rate of innovation is, and almost the speed of specification has come down as well. We're an extremely risk averse industry, quite rightly when we're building to regs and to quality standards. But I am now seeing innovations come from ideas to trial projects to being specified a lot quicker. It's interesting to see low carbon materials are this week have now done trial on motorway.
Yes,
their asphalt. And that's kind of
I think we're realizing we can do this. I mean, if you just think of COVID, I mean, the drugs that were used on those, and I know people have some issues with some of the drugs used on that, but the fact was that these drugs, which take decades sometimes to produce, and you might say this is part of the problem, but anyway, I hope this is a good example, but these drugs were produced in months, and if you accept that they were successful to a large degree, then that shows what you can do if you speed things up. Obviously, we've got to be careful about the safety and all the rest of it. And there is a danger in over speeding things, because you can make all sorts of horrific sort of problems. But I think the idea that you can produce better materials and things, and I suspect that things like AI will start to help with this. I mean, I don't think, I've got a rough idea. I've read The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleiman, which is about the whole AI. He was co-founder of DeepMind, which Google bought. And the book is quite, it's good. It's alarming and amazing. It's an equal measure. But if we can use that kind of approach to generate better, low carbon, more resource efficient materials, well then that will also sort of come on. I think that will start to impact what we do.
I agree. I think AI is going to have a huge positive impact on the built environment, especially when you sort of combine it with blockchain.
Yeah.
You start talking about categorizing materials and tracking that across the span of a building as well. So I think that's really interesting. We touched on new Labour government, big commitment to building, and I think for a long time there's probably been a lack of leadership within the built environment. Do you see that changing? Do you see this as a positive?
Yeah, I think overall it is. I mean, I think if you're accelerating activity, and I understand that that they want to, that there is a major problem with providing housing. I think once they've decided to do that, they need to ensure, as I say, they do it smart and low carbon and all the rest of it. Equally, I think their focus on things like green energy, you want to make sure that the turbines you produce are also being low carbon and all the rest of it. So, you want to make sure you're covering all your bases. And this is not, I don't believe, difficult if you just give the industry, I think the construction industry is amazingly innovative and can respond very quickly when they want to. I mean, I was reading a book about Mulberry Harbour, so that was produced, I think, was that Waits? I can't remember who built those, but whoever built it, I mean, that was produced by the construction industry, for a demand out of, nowhere. And I think, the construction industry can do it. It's got fantastic abilities to do that. So I think, if the doors are opened, I think, things can be made to happen. But I think it needs to be not just opened in a kind of open season sort of way, if you like. It's got to be open. The doors need to be opened, but saying, right, we want low carbon and zero carbon energy. We want low carbon. We want 1.5 million homes, but we want them done in a efficient, resource efficient, low carbon way.
We're an industry that's sometimes accused of working in silos as well, and I think it's great seeing a lot of cross-industry groups now that you're probably part of, people like Letty or ACAN or obviously UKGPC as well. Who do you feel, or CIC or CLC, who needs to take that leadership position?
I think all these forums are good, actually. I mean, I think, I've been involved, obviously, with the RICS, lead authoring the RICS standard, but I'm also involved with EN 15978, have been rather, and other things. And I think that you're never going to get a sort of perfect integration of all these things. But I think the fact that you've got Letty doing work on low carbon stuff, and then you've got net zero carbon building standard coming along, and you've got, so all these things are sort of jockeying up. And I think what they do is they just make sure there's a lot of activity in this area, which is good. I mean, I think it is good, and each of these initiatives may be doing something slightly different, but they kind of build on each other. So, I think the more activity there is, the better.
Big theme of our podcast is around impact and positive impact. And one thing we like to do is talk around those individuals that are really making a big positive impact in the built environment. I'm sure over your career you've worked very closely with a lot of people. Who sort of inspired you along your journey, and who would you highlight?
With specific reference to low carbon stuff?
Yeah.
I think there's a number of, I suppose, Duncan Baker Brown has always promoted the whole reuse thing, which I think is really important. I think sort of thought it through, but I think there's definitely others. I think people like Field and Clegg Bradley Studios. Jane Anderson has done amazing work on EPDs and assessment generally. I think that, the team we had doing the RICS standard was an amazing collection of people. There was Louisa Bowles, there was Paul Astle, Chen Lee, Lee Leston Jones, Athena Papacosta, and I'm sure I'm going to leave somebody out. But it was a great team of people who each in their own way has contributed to that standard. And I think why I come back to that is I think that is a real driver, because what it's done is it's sort of marked out what we felt good looks like, and what should be done. And I think the people who worked on it collectively, the whole thing came together, I think, really quite well. I mean, we went out to industry just over a year ago. I mean, the thing came out in September 23. Beginning of 23, we went out to industry to get responses, and we expected about 200 or 300 responses. We got 1,300 responses, which showed, and a lot of those overlapped. So it wasn't like we had 1,300 mistakes. We had 1,300 responses, and as I say, a lot of them overlapped, but and we absorbed a lot of that. So, and funny enough, since then there's been a couple of tweaks to correct errors or whatever, but actually we've had very little negative response that I'm aware of. And there'll be people saying, "Oh, well, we don't understand this" or something, but we haven't had sort of people throwing their arms up and saying this is wrong or nonsense or so on. And I think we brought in several innovations into that. I mean, one of them was, for example, the ability to convert, I forgot, Clara Bagnall George and Louise Amo.
Yes.
And Clara and Louise came up with a methodology for converting energy use into carbon emissions, which is pretty fundamental to the ability to do whole life carbon. Then we had, Jane Anderson developed a sort of whole way of looking at contingency and how to, in the same way with financial reporting, you have a contingency figure. For this, we actually had a contingency figure made up of 3 components, which may sound a bit elaborate, but the point of it was that the people doing assessments and working on whole life carbon, when they were looking to develop a contingency figure, they would understand the things that needed to be dealt with, if you like. So it's things like, the stage of the project, the quality of the information, quantity of information, and so on. So it was sort of highlighting those issues that were important. And we've had various other things. One of them was that you can now, in the first one, the 2017 version, it was very much individual building orientated and very definitely sort of skewed towards offices. This one, the new one, is much broader, covers all building types. It also covers infrastructure, whether it's national infrastructure, as in roads and railways and things, but also if you're doing a house, let's say a mixed-use scheme, it'll cover not just the new buildings, but the existing retrofitting of the existing buildings, the infrastructure between the roads and drainage and all that kind of thing. Power stations, renewable energy, all those sort of things will now be included. So you can actually get a holistic view of carbon performance.
Do you think we're at a point where there's going to be a whole shift in architecture and in terms of the style of design? I watched one of your presentations where we talked about the big glass offices that we used to see in the 90s, and that's just not going to be possible or wanted. I suppose it's coming from a client side, isn't it? If they want to hit.
Well, I think this is kind of an interesting point. I mean, my objection to all glass offices, if you like, is twofold. One is that to solve the energy problem by having, say, double glazed units, obviously require a lot of cooling. So what you do to solve that is you create these very deep glass units, which are double and are basically triple glazed. So there's 2 sheets and then a third sheet, and out of those, 2 of those sheets are laminated. So you've actually got 5 sheets of glass, and the carbon cost of putting all that in is high. But not only that, bearing what I said earlier about double glazing not lasting a great deal. In fact, some of those things, I know there was a scheme in the city that I was involved with briefly, which had the big, deep triple glazed units, and the temperatures inside that unit at the top of the building were expected to get up to 70 degrees centigrade. Well, that is just utter madness. And, it meant that seals and the machinery that drove the blinds and everything was all going to fail every 10 years. I mean, it's just, so you need to move away from that model. And I think where you have buildings which are much more hole in wall, where the wall is, let's say, 100-year or more better, life expectancy, with the windows which can be replaced individually, or you can replace the south facade, shall we say, or the top of the building, or whatever it is, or an individual tenancy or something, then that must be a better way forward. And so I think one of the problems that developers have is that quite often the advisors, the commercial agents, tend to look backwards rather than forwards, and consequently, they will do their kind of appraisals, if you like, financial appraisals on what they know will work, not on what needs to work for the future. And I've been in this position before. I mean, when I was working for Terry Farrell, I was design architect on Embankment Place, the building over Charing Cross Station. And at that point in time, the idea of these huge floor plates was kind of considered to be crazy, because office floors had to be 15 meters wide, and that was what, windows on either side, and that's how you did it. And so very deep floor plates for traders were considered to be, we had all these schemes which showed, or the valuation which showed that the central space was worth half the perimeter and so on. So, and of course now trying to get back to smaller floor plates is quite difficult, because everybody wants these deep.
Yeah.
So I think there is an inertia built into these things, but I think that, and I think also one issue I have continuously is the use of office type detailing for residential usage. So you've got those buildings just near the Tate Modern, which are like huge double glazed units, and we all know who the architect was. But you get these huge double glazed units, which, if you're somebody living in those, a young family or something, and one of those breaks, what do you do?
I know, they tried to market them as indoor gardens, didn't they, as well?
It's so inappropriate.
But I suppose we've got this challenge of, there's now a need, isn't there, for almost adaptable buildings, because, we talked about communities, or, the infrastructure as well, is that, the way we're using buildings is changing. From the pandemic came the whole work from home culture. Now we're much more of an agile probably workforce as well. And I've seen things like this week, and they announced that the HSBC building is going to be all converted into part residential, which poses all those problems that we just talked about.
Yeah, well, I think this is really interesting. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think buildings that are capable of adaptation to all sorts of uses are going to become are going to be much more the norm than the kind of highly bespoke kind of vanity project, if I can put it like that. I mean, funny enough, I think one of the most amazing examples of this, of course, is the Victorian warehouse, which started off as a warehouse and are now being used for just about any other use you care to name. I mean, they'd be used as obviously as offices and flats and cool clubs and virtually use. And the thing is that they're fundamentally robust. I mean, it's quite difficult to bash about a warehouse more than it can take. But they've also got a kind of a nice feel about them. They've got an atmosphere and a kind of that people like being in them.
Character, isn't it?
It's character, and it's it's architectural character and so on. And I think that kind of thought process is really important, because it means that they are endlessly recyclable, and they become fundamentally circular as a thing, because they don't fall to bits generally. You can also extend them if you want to, and you can change things, but they've got a fundamental solidity. Obviously, we want interesting, exciting, different sorts of buildings, but I think that's what we were talking about a bit earlier about, and a sort of new architecture coming out of this. I think part of that will be imaginative reuse of existing buildings because the resources are there.
Yeah.
They're already built. And the question is how best to use that.
Yeah.
And I think just to say, oh, well, it's not good enough, we'll knock it down and build another one. And quite often the replacements are actually worse in terms of durability than the thing they're replacing. So that quite often is an issue. I mean, to give you an example of Marks and Spencer, which I was involved in objecting to. So the existing buildings on the site, 2 of them were just under 50 years old, roughly.
Yeah.
And one of them, one on the corner that everybody knows, I think was around 90 years old. Now, the replacement building that was proposed, the life cycle analysis done by the engineers showed that apart from the structural frame, just about everything was going to need to be replaced within 35 years. So, the claim that these existing buildings on site were hopeless and unusable, and then to replace it with something which was going to have a comparatively short life, seemed to me nuts. And so I think we've got to start to think differently about how we can optimize. So I think we shouldn't be frightened of reusing buildings, and I'm not sort of advocating pickling them. Sort of, I think it's saying what's the best way to go forward on a building like this. Yes, you might get smaller. You might get a smaller building. You might, on the other hand, if you're imaginative, you might be able to stack stuff up on top of it or go out on top. But if you can come up with solutions which are fundamentally quicker to produce, so you get quicker planning, let's say you get less risk on planning ideally, and you also get speed of construction by comparison to new. And the interesting thing with Marks and Spencer, of course, is that that project started, I think, in about 2018, and they still haven't got where they need to be to completely build it. Had they done a refurbishment type scheme with extensions and what have you, they could have been finished that by now. They'd be pulling in income. So
where's that decision line? Let's take that example. Who's advising M&S to knock that down and not refit, or is that
well,
from an economics point of view? Is that design?
I suspect it's an economics point of view.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know.
No.
I really don't know. But my guess is that site, if you looked at that site and what they were proposing, the value of the finished building fully let was a significant amount of money.
Right.
And at the time that Marks and Spencer started on it in about 2018, their share price was pretty low. And so dealing with that site and developing and selling it, or even just getting the income, would have been a big plus in their balance sheet and so on. But obviously now Marks and Spencer's financial position is much better. Their share price has gone whooping up. Yeah. They're doing really well and so on. So I suspect that, yes, it's still a big number, but it's becoming more, because it's, I don't know, I just don't know, what their attitude is. Like, of course they want to do it. They wouldn't have taken it to the High Court if they wanted to give up on it. So
no, you're right. And I think it's almost like retrofit and reuse needs a rebrand, and it needs to be promoted as an exciting part of architecture rather than...
Yeah, well, there's a group that I'm kind of connected to, which is Don't Waste Buildings.
Okay.
Which is led by Will Hurst, editor of the Architect's Journal.
Yeah.
And that group is basically, well, it says what it says on the tin: don't waste buildings. It's promoting the idea that reuse of existing buildings is to be prioritized and applauded and enjoyed, as a way to deal with, make a contribution to dealing with the climate crisis.
I imagine a big part of this is going to be lobbying government as well on their VAT decision.
Yes, I mean, what we've tried to do with no waste buildings is not get too hung up on VAT.
Okay.
Because it is a kind of world of, it's quite, it's complicated. And also if you start asking the Treasury to do this, that, and the other, you're stuck. So we've tried to take a view which is much broader than that. That being said, I mean, I know with the Environment Audit Committee report, what I was keen to try and promote there was harmonisation of VAT rates rather than zero rating of everything. So if new build and refurbishment were the same rate, whatever that would be, not zero, but something higher than zero, then at least that would put everything on a level playing field. But as I say, messing with the Treasury is kind of something I guess you do at your peril. I mean, incidentally, on that thought, I mean, one thing I think would be a great thing to do is for the Treasury to be responsible for the UK's carbon budget, so that they, in the same way they allocate funds to ministries, if they would be able to allocate a carbon budget, based on the UK kind of what we're supposed to be expending in terms of United Nations agreements and what have you. If the Treasury was able to be the centre of that, rather than the net zero ministry, because if there's one Treasury that really carries clout, it's the Treasury. One ministry is the Treasury, and I think they could then enforce it, assuming they would have the will, and they, so that's what I would think would be really. It would put the UK in a position where carbon and money are put side by side, which I think would be a great thing to do.
And I think that goes back to that sort of point I made earlier, which is sometimes carbon scares people, or the lack of understanding. And I think putting in a more simplistic term like that, or something that people can understand, can only be a good thing.
Yes, and I think what's happened is that the whole issue of carbon and net zero got demonised by the last government as a kind of negative. There was all that hue and cry about the cars, Sadiq Khan and the cars and what have you. And I think it's really stupid that, because I think it is a potential sort of next industrial revolution. And I think that there are great opportunities, but we're sort of assuming everything's going to be bad. I think, and I think that, from my experience, I think a lot of people you talk to anecdotally are kind of not necessarily against the whole idea of net zero. And I think, but they need to be they need to feel that the government's behind it, not sort of against it. If the government was just, for example, if all government, I mean that in the construction playbook, government says it's going to be doing this, but if every government project included whole life carbon assessment, I think that was just known. That's what happened. I think you'd find that everybody would trot along behind that, and it wouldn't be a major problem. And the cost of doing an assessment now is really low. You think of it in comparison to, if you're building a block of flats, it's probably equivalent to cost of a carbon assessment is probably less than a bathroom in one of the flats. So what's all the fuss about? I mean, I think let's just do it.
I agree. Simon, I'm going to finish on the sort of final question for you, which is, what would be your advice to those people starting out in their career? A young architect coming through and who's extremely passionate and wants to make a real positive difference to the industry.
Yeah, I think you want to. In fact, this is a question for Mina Hassman, who I know
I'll save it.
You've got coming up. But I think that in a way there's no choice. I think they've got to get with the low carbon, net zero, all the rest of it program. I think it's exciting. I think it's going to evolve the way we think about things much more. I mean, I was at the RIBA about a year ago now, and there was an exhibition, student work. And one thing that I was really interested by was, so on most architects' drawings, you'll see timber use timber. It might even say hardwood or softwood if you really get kind of sophisticated. This was a drawing by a student of a 18th century sailing ship. And in those days, each timber type had a different use. So, whether it was elm or yew or oak or pine or whatever it was, it had a different use. So you would make the tiller out of one thing, you'd make the rudder out of something else, make the hull out of another one, the mast would be made out of a fourth or fifth timber and so on. And I think it's that understanding of really how materials can work is part of that and part of how the future, so you want architects to know that actually if you're going to specify windows, they should be made out of this.
Yeah.
Or, I'm not saying it has to be timber, but whatever it is made out of, it needs to be understood what you're doing. I mean, there's a world of difference between recycled aluminium and virgin aluminium, because, and if you specify, for example, anodizing, typically you need to have virgin aluminium, so it's all uniform. But if you're using recycled aluminium, which may not be uniform, then you typically can't use anodizing because you get variations in color. So you tend to go for powder coating, which covers all that up.
Yeah.
So it's those kind of micro understandings which I think, people need, really understanding how things really work.
Yeah.
I think is where, architects need to get to, and certainly the next generation of architects.
And just to finish on, I think as an industry, we've had a real challenge in terms of attracting talent into the workforce. A lot of people talk about the perception of the construction industry, but I think, as you said there, I think we've got a really bright future, because I think it is an exciting place to be at the moment.
I think the government, in a way, by saying we want 1.5 million homes, I mean, obviously there's investment issues, there's developers you've got to get on side and all the rest of it. But I think for architects, they need to say, right, that's the challenge. What's the new prototype? What's the typology? How do we design homes? I mean, what are the homes that most people live in London? They live in Victorian townhouse or terraces. Probably not most, but a large proportion. And what's the good thing about those is that, they're robust, and you can do what you like to them. So we need a sort of typology for new housing that is low carbon, is not overly bespoke, as we were talking earlier about. It needs to be adaptable so people can do extensions and things. And things like passive house, for example, which I would be nervous of, because yes, it gives optimum operational energy use, but it's not necessarily optimal in overall carbon usage. And also, if you've built a passive house and then you want to build an extension, then what do? Are you going to break the whole passive house thing by doing an extension? So I think you want something that has almost the performance of passive house. You want to have good embodied carbon credentials, both in construction, but also durability, reuse, and all the rest of it. And I think bringing all those things together, I think, is potentially really interesting and exciting. And I don't think we're there. I think, coming back to what I said earlier on, which is that at the end of the First World War, there was a lot of modernist housing being built, which was completely different to the sort of Edwardian era stuff that was built only 5-6 years before. And I think it's that kind of shift that we're going to be seeing.
Brilliant. Simon, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.